الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Let us begin our commemoration this evening and our presentation by remembering Imam al-Hussein and sending our salams to him and elevating our spirits by doing that. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. We have been talking about diversity within the Muslim community. And today we want to talk about a particular form of diversity that you find, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us in pairs, as male and female. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُمْ مِنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا. One of the signs of God is that He has created from you your spouse. And God has made us in pairs for a purpose. لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, so that you may seek out each other and you may find peace and tranquility in each other. And that is how in human society we form families, and as families we become part of the community. But generally, some have claimed that this distinction has also become a source of discrimination as well. Historically, it has become a source of marginalization, where the stronger gender has discriminated against the weaker gender. Some have even claimed that this discrimination continues to persist, or this marginalization continues to persist even within the Muslim community today. And it takes on different forms within the Muslim community. I just want to look at 3 forms that it takes within our own communities. Obviously not any particular community, but our communities in general. The first form is the space that you find given to women in the Muslim centers or in the Islamic centers. There is a documentary out there, and some of you might have seen the documentary, or you may have seen the trailer to that documentary, and it's called Unmasked. Yeah? Unmasked, you have seen it. Okay. So in Unmasked, they talk about people's experiences of how they stopped coming to the mosque. And when they talk to women, they generally say that one of the reasons we stopped coming to the mosques, amongst many reasons, is because when we came to the mosque, women were generally not given a spacious place, a nice and comfortable place for them to be inside the masjid. Their places of worship were generally in the masajid, very small, very narrow, very dark. Sometimes if they were lucky, they would be able to see the speaker or the program from a TV screen, or even just hear it from the audio, but they would not be able to see the proceedings that were happening in their own mosques. They also pointed out that there were barriers whereby they were not able to participate fully in the program itself, and that men generally were active in participating in the programs. They dictated the programs, but women were passive participants in the program itself. Secondly, they say women are also marginalized when it comes to academic discussions, when it comes to scholarly discussions. That generally you will find that the speakers and the scholars, even sometimes when you have seminars and forums, are generally men, and women don't have an opportunity whereby they can voice their opinions or they can voice their thoughts. Somebody had sent me an image. I'm not sure how true that image is, but in some part of the world, they were having a conference about women. And everybody at the conference was a man. Okay. The third thing that you also find is that in Islamic centers, sometimes women are not part of the decision-making process, meaning that important decisions are made in the community, decisions that pertain to them, pertain to their space and their role, but they are not included in the decision-making process. And they are either told that it is inappropriate for them to be included or that they do not have the intellectual capacity for it. I'm just saying it the way it sometimes happens to be. Okay. Now, there are different ways that the Muslim community has responded to that. So if you watch the documentary, you will see that some people have generally stopped coming to the mosque. Or some people have found that the mosque is no longer an active and important part of their own lives. Or some people have found that they can find spiritual growth and they can find spiritual elevation in organizations and centers outside the Islamic centers. And they spend their time over there and they put their efforts into those organizations. And then there's an interesting contemporary movement, a movement of feminism or something akin to feminism within the Muslim community, where men and women are saying that we need to advocate for the rights of women within the Muslim community and demand for their rights inside Islamic centers as well. Now, this is an important discussion for us to have within our community. And I'm going to break down the discussion into 3 questions. Firstly, what is the Islamic perspective on women? How does the Quran talk about women? Does the Quran talk about women in a respectful manner or a derogatory manner? What's the Quranic narrative, not just narration, but what's the Quranic narrative about women as we compare it to other texts and to other scriptures? Now, point out one thing. Today's discussion is going to be a theoretical discussion. And I cannot avoid that discussion because I need that discussion to build the foundation for the next 2 questions, which I'm going to be answering tomorrow. Secondly, in an Islamic community, are we in need of a feminist movement? And if so, what sort of a feminist movement? Or do we just have to go back to the authentic teachings of the Quran, and whatever is needed to be done in an Islamic community can be found in the teachings of the Quran? And the third question that I want to look at tomorrow is that what should our general approach be to gender relations and the contribution and the role of women within an Islamic society? So these are the 3 things we want to look at if you recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So when the Prophet of Allah came to Arabia, he saw that women were being denied some of their basic rights. And to give you an example of it, women were denied the right to inheritance. They were denied the right to independence and autonomy. They could not decide who to get married to or who not to get married to. In fact, women were treated like cattle, in the sense that when a person passed away, his inheritance would include his cattle, his property, his house, his wealth, and also his wives as well. And his eldest son would inherit them, and he could do with him as he chose to do with them. This was the status of women within Arabian society. Daughters were even buried alive at that time. The Prophet of Allah wants to change how the people treat women, but he knows that he cannot change how they treat women until he changes how they think about women. So you find in the Quran, it first starts to talk about what a woman is in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I want to present it in 4 points. So the first point that the Quran makes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that when you think of women, first think of her as a human being, and then think of her as a woman. Shaheed Murtada Mutahhari makes a very subtle point over here. He says that the Quran recognizes and affirms that there is a strong similarity between men and women, and their similarity is in their humanity. But that there is also a difference between men and women, and their difference is in their femininity. In a woman's femininity, a man's masculinity. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas, O mankind, اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها. Be wary of your Lord, who has created you from a single soul, and from that soul created its spouse. Now, Mufassirin of the Quran say that that singular soul refers obviously to Prophet Adam alayhi salam. But then there is a difference of opinion amongst commentators of the Quran. When God says in the Quran, and from that soul he created its spouse, what exactly is it saying over there? Is it saying that God created Hawa, Lady Hawa, from the body of Prophet Adam alayhi salam? And you find there are narrations to that effect even in our ahadith as well. Ahadith that speak about the fact that Prophet Adam was created, Lady Hawa was created from the rib of Prophet Adam. And you find that this is also mentioned very clearly in biblical narrations as well. Okay? In fact, some of the scholars have claimed that the narrations that we have within our texts have actually come from biblical narrations which have been inserted in the corpus of our ahadith, and they are not authentic. So, is God trying to say that Lady Hawa was created from the rib of Adam? Or is God trying to say that Lady Hawa was created from the same substance that Prophet Adam was created? And just as Adam is primarily a human being, Lady Hawa is also just as much a human being. Now, you may wonder right now that what's the purpose of this discussion? It seems like a theoretical discussion which has absolutely no practical consequences. Well, it does have a practical consequence. Because if you say that a woman was created from the rib of a man, it gives rise to this idea and this theology that a woman was created to serve man. Man was created to serve God, and women were created to serve men. Now, you will say, who would have such an ideology? Who would have such a thought in their minds? So it's very interesting in the Bible, in the book of Corinthians, okay? Verses 6 and 7, I can't remember which chapter, but verses 6 and 7, it talks about this. So verse 6 actually talks about hijab and the fact that a woman should cover her hair. And it says that a woman, verse 6 says, that a woman should cover her hair, but if she doesn't want to cover her hair, she should shave her hair. Okay? She doesn't want to cover her hair, she should shave her hair. Verse number 7 in the Bible gives the reasoning for it, and now I read it for you verbatim. It says, "For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man." So, coming back to the question, did God create Lady Hawa from the body of Adam, or did he create her from the same substance? Mufassirin of the Quran, like Allama Tabatabai, like Ayatollah Nasser Makarim Shirazi, are very clear in saying what this verse is saying according to the grammar that we have over there, and according to other verses of the Quran. The verse is saying that Hawa was created from the same substance as Prophet Adam, meaning she is just as human and primarily should be seen as human as Prophet Adam is. Now, we have also a hadith to this effect. somebody came to the fifth Imam and said, I have heard these narrations, and they seem to me Israeliyat. Israeliyat are biblical narratives which made their way into our narrations. I have heard that Lady Hawa was created from the rib of Adam. And the fifth Imam said, do you think that God is incapable of creating Hawa separately, that he has to create her from the rib of Adam alayhi salam? So our ahadith and ayat of the Quran reject that idea. Secondly, the Quran also rejects the idea that a woman is a source of sin and temptation, and that a woman would easily give into temptation. Now again, you might be scratching your head over here wondering, why are we talking about this? Well, we're talking about this because historically, this is one of the reasons that has been used in Western society in the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages to marginalize women, to silence the voice of women, to marginalize them in society and say that a woman should not have a contribution to society. Her contribution should just be limited to the home, and her contribution should be limited to being a mother and being a housewife, but she should not come into society. And the reasoning they gave behind that was to say that a woman is a source of sin and a source of temptation. Now you would wonder to yourself, where would a person get this sort of thinking? Well, it turns out in the Middle Ages, the source of morality was the Bible. The Bible was the source of gender and ethics morality. And this sort of idea was an amalgamation of the verses of the Bible and the cultures that were present at that time. Many scholars throughout the Dark Ages argued that women should not have a role in society simply because they were a source of temptation and that they would easily give into temptation. And the example that they used from the Bible is the story of Adam and Eve. It's a story, but a very symbolic story. And it symbolizes the role of man and the role of women according to that scripture. Now, in the Bible, it is interesting that when it talks about the story of Prophet Adam in paradise, it says that God said to Adam, do not eat or do not come near that tree. Then after a while, Prophet Adam ate, and Lady Hawa ate from that tree. And God asked them, Adam and Hawa, where are you? And they were hiding behind a bush. So they said, we are hiding behind a bush. And God asks them in the Bible, well, why are you doing that? And they say, well, we're doing this because we are ashamed of our nakedness. God says to them, did you eat from that tree? And Adam says, yes, I ate from that tree. God says to them, well, why did you eat from that tree? The response is an interesting response. So Adam says, the man said, the woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it. Okay? So in the biblical narrative, not just narration, but in the biblical narrative, it blames Lady Hawa for tempting Adam and for being tempted in the first place. Let's come to the Quranic narration now. You'll find that the Quranic narrations are very different from the narrations of the Old and the New Testament. It's important to make a point of that. Because sometimes you'll find even today a person may come up to you, or you may come across a website which actually claims that the Quran has plagiarized stories from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they also used to claim that during the time of the Holy Prophet. So it's important to understand that there are three significant differences between the narrations of the Quran and the narrations of the Bible. The first difference is the difference in content. And we'll see right now the content is different. The facts are different. The second difference is a difference in style. The Quran primarily does not see itself as a book of history, nor does it see itself as a book of stories, nor does it see itself as a scientific book. It sees itself as a book of morality. It sees itself as a book of theology, and therefore its style in narrating a story is very different from the style of other texts. And the third difference, besides content and style, is also a difference in theology. The way the Quran looks at things is different from the way other books look at those things. Now, in the Quran, when God talks about the story of Adam, and he comes to the point where it's talking about who was tempted to go near the tree Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَوَسْوَسَ لَهُمَا الشَّيْطَانُ لِيُبْدِيَ لَهُمَا مَا وُرِيَ عَنْهُمَا مِنْ سَوْآتِهِمَا. Shaitan came to them and him tempted both of them. It doesn't blame one more than the other. So the second point the Quran makes is that a woman is not a source of sin or temptation, or is not more prone to temptation than a man is. We're breaking down those ideas that lead to marginalization. The third point the Quran makes is that a woman has the same spiritual aspirations as a man. Just as God created a man to serve him and become his abd, he also created a woman to serve him and to become his abd or amah as well. Now, let me first give you an idea of the trajectory of the arguments that we're going to have. Some point today or some point tomorrow, I'm going to say that the most important or one of the most important roles for a woman is to be a mother, is to be a wife in the house, is to be this nucleus within the family. And whether that discussion is politically correct or not politically correct is not going to concern me, because we have to teach it the way it's in the Quran and the way it's taught by the Ahlul Bayt. But when I do say that, I'm not going to be saying that because God created a woman to serve man or to serve the needs of man. The Quran is very clear about that. God has created her to serve him, and everything that she does is for the purpose of serving him, and she has a role to play in her society and in her family as well. Now, Shahid Mutahari here makes a very important point. He says God in the Quran has made salvation contingent upon two things. He's not made it contingent upon which culture you come from. He's not made it contingent upon which race you come from. He's also not made it contingent upon which gender you come from. Salvation in the Quran is only contingent upon two things. The first one is faith in God, and the second one is righteous actions. So God says in the Quran, مَنْ عَمِلَ صَالِحًا مِّن ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ فَلَنُحْيِيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبَةً. Whoever performs an act of righteousness, whether it is a dhakar, a man, or a untha, or a woman, with the condition that they are believing, God is going to raise them with a new life, with a wholesome life, with a complete life, and God is going to place them in paradise. Now, once when I was talking about this, a young man came up to me and said, if that's the case, then I have a question. And my question is that if you're saying that a woman can have the same spiritual aspiration and can reach the same spiritual station as a man, and God makes absolutely no distinction at that spiritual level, then explain to me why is it that prophets of God have all been men and we have no women who are prophets of God? Okay? Isn't it because to be a prophet of God, you have to reach a particular spiritual station where you can become worthy of receiving divine revelation, and women have not been able to reach that spiritual station? Okay? I'm going to answer this in two ways. Okay? Firstly, as far as spiritual stations are concerned, the Quran says we make no distinction between men and women. If prophets of God are capable of receiving divine revelation, even women and other human beings are able to reach that station where they also receive divine inspiration. And I'll give you two examples from the Quran, and it's very interesting. The Quran on this issue, whenever it gives us an example, it gives us the example of women. Okay? First example is the example of the mother of Prophet Musa alayhi salam. When she was afraid for his life, God says in the Quran, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَىٰ أُمِّ مُوسَى. We did wahi, the word used in the Quran is wahi. We did wahi to the mother of Musa. Now, this wahi is not a prophetic revelation, but this wahi is indeed a divine inspiration. The Quran also gives us a second example. And in this second example, not only was there an inspiration, but angels actually descended. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talks about the mother of Prophet Isa, He says, وَإِذْ قَالَتِ الْمَلَائِكَةُ يَا مَرْيَمْ. And remember that time when the angels descended upon Lady Mary, and they said to her, O Maryam, Ya Maryam, inna Allah hastafaki, God has chosen you, وَطَهَّرَكِ, and purified you, وَاصْطَفَاكِ عَلَى نِسَاءِ الْعَالَمِينَ, God has chosen you over all the women in the world. Ya Maryam قُنُتِي لِرَبِّكِ, O Maryam, humble yourself in the presence of God, wasjudi, and do sujood, warka'i ma'ar raki'in, and bow with those who are bowing. According to some narrations, this means bow with the angels of God who are bowing. Now, before I continue, it is narrated in some of our traditions that when Lady Fatima asked her father, the Prophet of Allah, that even I am Sayyidatu Nisa'il Alameen, I am the leader of the women of the entire universe, what's the difference between me and Lady Mary? And the Prophet of Allah explained to her that Maryam was chosen out of all the women of her time, and God has chosen you out of all the women of humanity, from the beginning of time until the end of time. So, second example where a lady is able to see angels and receive divine inspiration as well. Now, here Ayatollah Javadi Amuli makes an interesting point. He says that if you think about it, prophethood is actually a consequence of the position of wilayah. When somebody reaches that position of wilayatullah, of becoming a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then sometimes a consequence of that is either he gets the position of prophethood or he gets the position of imamah, or sometimes they don't get a position. Now, Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli says that as far as the position of becoming a wali of Allah is concerned, God makes no discrimination. Just as a man can become a wali of Allah, a woman can also become a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says examples like Lady Asiya, like Lady Maryam, like Lady Fatima, like Lady Zainab are examples of women who became wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then he also goes on, and that's the second point I want to make right now. Then he also goes on and he says that the reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not make them prophets is because prophethood also has certain responsibilities. It has social, political responsibilities. It has responsibilities on the field of battle. It has difficult responsibilities. And because of that, either during that time, women may not have been accepted in that position, or it may have become difficult for a woman to fulfill some of these responsibilities, and only because of that did God not give them the station of prophethood. So the first 3 points are important points. The fourth point the Quran makes is to say that when Quran talks about women, it talks about them in a very dignified manner, in a very respectful manner. It never talks about them in a derogatory manner, or it never talks about them in a phobic manner. It never talks about them in a selective manner either. Now let me give an example over here. When the media wants to demonize Muslims and it wants to create phobia of Muslims, you know that the media doesn't have to come and say that Muslims are violent. It doesn't have to say that Muslims are terrorists. It doesn't have to say that Muslims are, you need to be afraid of Muslims. See, all the media has to do is called something called selective news reporting. So anytime you have a Muslim who blows up a building or he kills somebody, you report it in the media and you hype it up. And you report it 24/7, at least for 2 to 3 days, and you actually hype up his Islamic credentials, right? He used to go to this mosque, he met with this scholar, he traveled to this country, he was visiting these Islamic websites, he was reading these books. You hype that up. But when Muslims do something good, which is 99.99% of Muslims, they go and help out in a charity, they open up an orphanage, they open up a social advocacy group, they advocate for the rights of the oppressed and those who are underprivileged. Will the media report it? No, report it, right? So what is the message that it gives to the viewer? The message it gives to the viewer is to say that, well, Muslims are violent people. All the Muslims that we've come to know are very violent people. And actually, they don't even have to say it. That's the subtle message ingrained when you do selective news reporting, right? There's a Canadian thinker and a writer, and he said that the medium is the message, meaning that it's not only the content that gives a message, but the way you report that content and selectively report it, that also gives a message as well. Well, let's come to the Quran, and let's see how God talks about women in the Quran as compared to other books, right? Is God selective in talking about women? Shahid Murtada Mutahari again. He says that when you look at it, when God talks about women in the Quran, He talks about them with reverence and respect. He talks about the mother of Prophet Musa, the mother of Prophet Isa, the wife of Prophet Adam, the wife of Prophet Ibrahim, and He talks about them with reverence and dignity. There are places in the Quran where God talks about a couple of women who betrayed prophets of God. It talks about the wife of Prophet Nuh, and it talks about the wife of Prophet Lut, right? And it says, فَخَانَتَاهُمَا, they betrayed their husbands, and they betrayed prophets of God. Shahid Mutahari says, even when you look at that particular passage of the Quran, right after God talks about these two women who are not supposed to be role models, immediately in the following verse and the verse after that, it talks about two women who are supposed to be role models. وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا رَأَةَ فِرْعَوْنَ. And God sets forth the parable for those who believe, the wife of Fir'aun. And the Arabic text of this verse is also quite interesting, because from the Arabic text you come to realize that the wife of Fir'aun, Lady Asiya, is not only a role model for women, she's also a role model for men as well. And it talks about the mother of Prophet Isa alayhi salam. So 4 points that we take from the Quran. Now, one more question before we come to tomorrow's discussion. What does Islam say about the intellectual capacity of a woman? Doesn't the Sharia look down upon the intellectual capacity of a woman? You will say, how so? Well, somebody will say that we have got categories of ahadith that actually question the intellectual capacity of a woman. And some of you may have come across these ahadith. Some of you may not have come across these ahadith, but you will at some point come across them. Somebody will come up to you and say, well, what sort of a religion do you believe in when it has got narrations in the books of ahadith that question the intellectual capacity of a woman? You will say, well, where is that in our corpus of hadith? If you go to the Nahj al-Balagha, sermon number 79 or sermon number 80, it is said that after the Battle of Jamal, when Imam Ali was giving a sermon, in one of these sermons he said, and I will quote that right now, he said, "Ma'ashirun nas, O people, inna an-nisa nawaqisul iman, nawaqisul hudud, wa nawaqisul uqul." We have to deal with these issues, by the way. You cannot escape them, right? O people, among many things, women are defective in their intellect. Okay. Somebody would also add on to that, isn't it true that some of the laws of Islam are predicated of this fact? For example, women get half the shares of man in inheritance. The testimony of a woman is half the testimony of a man. You need 2 women in the place of 1 man. Even when it comes to a discussion about women becoming judges within a Muslim community, you will see that some people will claim that no, they cannot become judges. Isn't it because of this very same reason? Now, we want to look at the response that some of our scholars have given. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, how important is this discussion once again? And why are we having this discussion? It's one thing when somebody comes and asks you about it and you say, well, I can furnish you a response and explain to you why and justify to you why my traditions say that. But what implications does it have in our societies, in our communities, whether we consider women to be intellectually capable or not? The reason we're having this discussion is because there seems to be this sort of mindset, historically speaking, or there seems to be this sort of mindset within certain cultures. And this is the mindset that stops us from allowing women to have a social role in society. Stops us from seeing women as somebody who can contribute to the academic discussions and be part of the decision making within society. And we want to look into our traditions and to see, well, do our traditions really say that? Or is it a cultural idea that we have taken and we have held on to certain obscure traditions, put these two together, and given that cultural idea a religious backing? Okay. So our scholars in general have answered this question in one of four ways. The first way that they have answered it is to say that these traditions have absolutely no authenticity. How can they have no authenticity when they appear in Nahjul Balagha? Well, it turns out Sharif al-Radi, when he was writing Nahjul Balagha, he wasn't writing and compiling a book of hadith. Sharif al-Radi was actually compiling a book of eloquence. He was more interested in the eloquence of the text than the authenticity of the narration. Therefore, you find in his compilation, which is different from other compilations of hadith, he does not mention who has reported this hadith. There are other books which do mention something similar to this hadith, but all of them, when you go to these books, you will notice at some point they don't mention the chain of narrators. Meaning somebody in history says, I have heard this from the sixth Imam, or I have heard this from the first Imam. Well, how have you heard it? Who has narrated it to you? They don't mention it. So one, it is devoid of authenticity. And with that, the discussion is closed. But there are three other answers, and the fourth one is the one that interests me the most today. The second answer that some of our scholars have given is to say that it was given at a particular time. And it refers to particular individuals and not women in general. And I'll leave that discussion at that. Okay? The third is to say that the hadith is not talking about intelligence per se. It's trying to make a distinction between rational intellect and the emotional intellect. Rational IQ and emotional IQ. And we'll leave that one at that as well. The fourth one is the one that's entertained by Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli. Now, Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli says, let us assume that the hadith is correct, but we don't accept that it's correct. The hadith does not have a proper chain of narrators. Okay? In fact, it doesn't even have, to some extent, any chain of narrators. He says, let's assume that the hadith is correct. He says the hadith is not talking about the nature of women in general. The Imam is talking about the women who existed in his society. And those women were products of their own social and cultural circumstance. During that time, they did not have the opportunity to learn, to educate themselves, to see intellectual growth. And therefore, it might be true that women at that time did not have the same intellectual capacity as men. Not because they couldn't have, but because they didn't have the opportunity for that particular growth. Then he says, well, what about women in this day and age, where a woman goes and studies and graduates from a college or a university, where she is successful in her career, she is successful in her profession? Does this also apply to her as well? And he says it doesn't. Okay. Now, having said this, we have now set the stage for our discussions for tomorrow. And the two questions that we want to answer tomorrow is, so do we really need feminism? And when you talk about feminism, what sort of feminism are you talking about? Modernist feminism? Postmodernist feminism? Liberal feminism? Radical feminism? And what is known as white liberal feminism. Because you find that these are ideas which have been thrown into the Muslim community, but we haven't questioned the basis for these ideas, right? One of the things we said 2 days ago is whenever you come across a new idea, before you accept it and adopt it in your community, start thinking about the fundamental basis to those ideas. Well, what is white liberal feminism that even postmodern feminists are strongly objecting to, yet you find it within our communities? Or do we simply have to go back to the teachings of the Quran And the second question that we're going to look at tomorrow night, inshallah, is to see what is the approach that we should take for women in the community, and what is a good role for them to have in an Islamic community. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Once again tonight we want to go to Karbala, and we want to remember the tragedy that befell Imam al-Hussein. Until last night we were remembering the companions of Imam al-Hussein, and tonight we want to start remembering the family members of Imam al-Hussein. On the day of Ashura, Imam al-Hussein saw at least 18 members of his family being killed in front of him. And amongst them were Aoun and Muhammad, the sons of Abdullah ibn Ja'far. And they came with Lady Zainab to the plains of Karbala. So let us take our hearts to Karbala to be near the shrine of Imam al-Hussein. Let us do tawassul to him. Ya Aba Abdillah, Ya Hussein ibn Ali, أيها الشهيد يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا، يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله، يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. One of the ladies who sacrificed everything she had for Imam al-Hussein was Lady Zainab alayha salam. She was with Imam al-Hussein all throughout his journey. She left with him from Medina. She was with him in Mecca, in all the stations leading up to Karbala. And she also sacrificed her son and the sons of Abdullah for Imam al-Hussein. Aoun and Muhammad were not with the caravan of Imam al-Hussein, but their father sent them to join Imam al-Hussein. And they met up with the Imam at one of the stations, and they brought a letter from their father. In that letter he wrote, إن هلكت اليوم طفئ نور الأرض فإنك علم المهتدين ورجاء المؤمنين. O Hussein, if you were to die today, the light of the earth will be extinguished, for you are certainly the flag of those who have hope, and you are certainly the hope of those who have faith. And they joined Imam al-Hussein, and the Imam thanked them. And they finally reached the plains of Karbala. Day by day, the enemies would enter the plains of Karbala. They surrounded Imam al-Hussein. To say it on the day before Ashura, or perhaps on the day of Ashura, Imam al-Hussein was once sharpening his sword, and he was sitting on the ground, and he started to recite some lines of poetry, and Ali al-Akbar could hear him, and Lady Zainab alayha salam could hear him, and he was reciting the lines of poetry, and he said, يا دهر أفل لك من خليل كم لك بالإشراق والأصيل. And then later the Imam said, وما أقرب الوعد من الرحيل وإنما الأمر إلى الجليل. He said, O time, what a bad companion you are, what a circumstance we are in. But he said that the command is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how near is that moment that we would pass away. Lady Zainab alayha salam started to cry. She could not contain her tears. She said to him, "O Hussein, what are you reciting?" She said, "Wa Husayna yan'i al-Husayn nafsa." Al-Hussein is reciting his own poetry. He is reciting his own marthiyah. Imam al-Hussein consoled her. Imam al-Hussein said to her, "Ta'azzi bi'aza'i Allah. I console you for the sake of Allah. وَاعْلَمِ أَنَّ أَهْلَ الْأَرْضِ يَمُوتُونَ. And know that the people and the inhabitants of the earth will die. وَأَهْلَ السَّمَاءِ لَا يَبْقُونَ. And the people of the heavens are not going to survive. وَكُلُّ شَيْءٍ هَالِكٌ إِلَّا وَجْهَهُ. And everything is going to diminish and get destroyed except for the recognition of God." And he consoled her. But the women were crying, and the children were crying. The narrator says, when Kulthum heard the poetry of Imam al-Husayn, she started to say, "Wa Muhammadaya, wa Aliya, wa Umma, wa Husayna, وضيعتنا بعدك." O Hussein, who is going to take care of us after you? On the night before the day of Ashura, even Aun and Muhammad came to Imam al-Hussein, and they said to him, "We're not going to betray you on this night. We're not going to betray you tomorrow." And they say to him, "لم نفعل ذلك لنبقي بعدك لا أرانا الله ذلك أبدا." We shall not betray you. We do not want to remain alive after you. The next day, after the companions had given their lives, after Habib ibn Madahir, after Muslim ibn Awsaja, after Zuhair ibn Qayyin had been martyred, Aun and Muhammad came to Imam al-Hussein. And they said, "Oh, our uncle, allow us to go to the battlefield." Imam al-Hussein did not want them to go, but Lady Zainab insisted. So they went to the battlefield. These are the grandsons of Ja'far al-Tayyar. They fought bravely on the plains of Karbala. They came out to the battlefield, and they said, "In tankiruni, فأنا ابن جعفر شهيد صدق في الجنان أزهري." If you don't know me, then I am the grandson of Ja'far, the one who flies with wings in paradise. His brother complained, and he said, "تشكو نشكو إلى الله من العدوان قتال قوم في الردي عميان." We only complain to Allah because of the calamities that we face. They fought bravely on the plains of Karbala, but alas, they fell to the plains of Karbala. They called out to Imam al-Hussein, "As-salamu alayya, ya Aba Abdillah." The narrator says, Imam al-Hussein came to the battlefield. He picked up their bodies. He brought them back to the tent. He brought them to Lady Zainab alayha salam. Imagine that moment when the mother looks at the bodies of her children. What must she have done at that time? But the narrator says, "I did not see the daughter of Ali crying at that time, but there was a moment on the day of Ashura when the body of Ali al-Akbar, the son of Imam al-Hussein, was being brought back towards the tent, and I saw the daughter of Ali coming out of her tent. She ran to the body of Ali al-Akbar. She threw herself on the body of Ali al-Akbar, and she called out out to him, Wa Habibaya, Ya ibna akha, O my beloved, O son of my brother, who has done this. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا آل محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله